Hello and welcome to Tremaine Sci Fi. Today we're discussing all things aliens. To kick us off, if you look at some of the aliens in written fiction, okay, so a lot of them have to do with obviously mutated humans and humans with, that's in a book I'm forgetting the name of that's about a ship that's defending against a phenomenon that causes time shifts, and there are creatures that try to reach out of it. I think it's called The Last Stand or something, or The Divide, and it's written by J.S. Dews, and a lot of the aliens are mutants because it would be fair to say we don't quite know what life on other planets would necessarily look like, so we have to assume that it would in stories it's either very strange or very very humanoid. Can you think of any examples of very far off aliens? Or
do you consider Lovecraftian elder
you mean
gods and
like
stuff
the
to
elder
be
gods? Yeah.
alien?
So this is something
They're alien in a sense of alien to our mind.
Right. This is what Jodo and I were talking about, is fantasy and sci-fi. Apparently, according to this article we read, fantasy is a subgenre of sci-fi, which, is a bit... it predates... does sci-fi... I thought sci-fi predated fantasy, but this article seemed pretty adamant that it was...
Oh, I wouldn't say sci-fi, if you use the loosest terms, which I generally consider now to be speculative fiction as opposed to science fiction,
Right.
you go back to... sci-fi, you go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but speculative fiction, you've got Around the World in 80 Days, you got
There was
all the Jules Verne stuff.
Yeah. There's even, ancient... would you consider Atlantis as sort of like science fiction?
Well, science
I'd put it
fiction
as
dates back to
speculative
the
fiction,
second
sure.
century, I think, is
Yeah.
what that. So it's like something written by. Hold on, it's in this article. A true
you
story
consider
written by the
it,
Syrian
isn't it?
satirist Lucian
Oh,
is
yes,
thought
yes.
to be the first sci-fi story which explored other universes and extraterrestrial life forms.
Right, so it certainly predates what our conception of speculative and sci-fi is. But moving back to aliens, I think what were some of the extraterrestrials that were in ancient life that are different from our modern day conceptions?
I'm just not sure they were meant much in the way of alien. Maybe some old Hindu stuff.
Right.
Maybe not even necessarily Hindu, but Indian stuff. It's the earliest I can think of where they leave the world itself. Because some of the really old Sanskrit stuff has things with mechanical birds,
Right.
stuff that in modern interpretation you'd consider to be like nuclear weaponry.
Right, so weapons that could completely eradicate cities, or
turn them to glass.
okay, so something super hot, yeah.
Quite seems like nuclear weaponry, and we're talking a few thousand years BC.
So, yeah. I suppose...
But...
Yeah.
Death of the author, is the intent to be science fiction there? Because a lot of this is religious poetry. It's... Yeah. I have a problem with intent.
It's what we were talking about with Nostradamus, wasn't it? Where we were discussing, was he actually a prophet or was he just writing poetry? And it was very clearly just poetry. But now there's sort of I suppose that has to do with what we... I think what we were thinking there's a weapon that turns cities to glass. I think we're probably putting our modern hindsight into that, aren't we? Because obviously there was no way of knowing whether or not atomic weapons would be developed. And also, we just know that sand turns to glass. So
Well, I mean, well before his time, they were vitrified. They'd made walls of stone, but they'd built fires inside it, and they'd turned the stone into essentially the same as volcanic glass. So
right,
you
yeah.
can find glass walls of forts and stuff. So it wasn't outside of.
The realm of possibility.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think
It was just a matter
also,
of extent.
but in a lot of sci-fi, and particularly how we interpret aliens, is there's a lot of conquering and a lot of
Colonialism.
colonialism and imperialism, and this I wonder if it comes from our past or if it comes from how we would think aliens would act. I mean, obviously, when Europeans and Asians left their homelands and started conquering outside of their homeland and became colonial powers, they developed. They were obviously more technologically developed than. Sorry, may have been more technologically developed than the ones they were invading. So, I mean, Joda, do you have any sort of insight onto imperialism, I guess, in sci-fi?
Uh, yeah, it can be. I think it can be used in multiple ways. One being for showing the trail of blood that imperialism can leave.
Right.
It also can be used as propaganda for explaining why imperialism should be used, showing like the certain way, like, oh, we're fearful of what aliens will do when they show up, so we have to make sure that we fight them and like tear them down
Right.
at any cost.
And what do you?
Um,
Sorry, what did you mean by trail of blood? Is that sort of the literal meaning, or is there some sort of historical meaning that
the
should be
I would say
clarified?
the literal meaning, like if you look at maybe War of the Worlds,
Right.
that's that was Wells' like, a comparison, I think, to the invasion or expansion of Tasmania. Um, or like it literally says that in the book. There was an explicit comparison of the Martian invasion to the colonial expansion into Tasmania.
Right.
So it can be used to show comparing the colonizers to a devastating alien invasion.
Monsters, essentially. Right. Like,
Yes.
I mean that. I believe in War of the Worlds. There's eating people. I think. Jag.
They use people as fertilizer, I think it
Oh, okay,
was.
okay, yeah. So I mean
Call them
that's
eating
obviously
people directly.
that's probably quite brutal. I think is the idea of just chopping people up and then using them as fertilizer. Because in our minds, we aren't meant to be fertilizer. We're meant to be the conquerors. We're meant to be the superior beings. So, how does that sort of translate into sci-fi, Jodo? Is there sort of a concept of human superiority? Is that also to do with maybe uh, what's the
Right. I
term?
would say the concept of human superiority is used when there is a propaganda tone behind the work. So you can see it even in Star Trek, because Star Trek kind of started around the same time as the Cold War.
Right. Yeah.
So the Federation was supposed to be kind of the US and its NATO allies, and the Empire was like the USSR and its satellites.
Right. So
So
yeah.
you can see that in the works of the time. A lot of this happens in any field, science, movies, literature. A lot of the work is driven by the politics of the time.
Right. I believe.
Uh,
Sorry. Carry on.
no, I was just gonna say, and that can definitely be seen in modern and like
Right.
not so modern sci-fi.
So like how we see a lot of guerrilla warfare movies like Predator and help me out here, Jag. I think there are more examples of guerrilla warfare, but that sort of insurgent style of these are terrorists or they're just rebels. But Jag, you were telling me a little while ago about a sci-fi that was written about. It sort of just glossed over the fact that the entire Earth had become Anglified, or like everyone was English or British by this writer. I think he was, and then the British Empire was out conquering Earth. I think so. Is that sort of an example of the assumption people make from their time zone? Because obviously, at a certain point, many people thought the British Empire would just be the world.
So, I mean, there's a lot of different authors who go different directions with that.
Right.
And not just authors, also showrunners. Firefly has them being a mix of Chinese, Russian, and English.
Right.
Whoever it was that did Integral Trees, not Harry Harrison. It'll come to me. But in his future far off space stories, it's definitely English and Russian. Basically, if you're looking outside of Earth itself, quite often the language or culture they'll have is whoever was in a space race at the time.
Right, so it would be the Russians, the English speakers, Chinese. So
yeah,
I suppose that makes us probably quite what we were talking about last episode, and you should also check that out if you've enjoyed this so far. But is this idea that humans will eventually conquer. And I think that's sort of the idea, isn't that the idea behind Manifest Destiny, Jodo? That might be the sort of idea that humans are destined to conquer and explore, which we, not maybe destined, but certainly enjoy doing. What can you sort of tell us about, and if you don't know what Manifest Destiny is, Jodo will now explain.
Don't put that on me. Manifest Destiny is just the idea that the settlers and colonizers in the U.S. Had the right to everything that was to the West.
Right.
Because of it. So I think that happens a lot, and especially like you said, any of the space races, Jag, the language is reflective of who was in it at the time. I think the entire work is reflective of where the work is made or written or filmed. So, and like what time period it's in.
Absolutely.
So you're going to see a difference between Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica versus like Doctor Who, and who the like aggressor is in the film.
Right.
Or the
So
book.
who's the aggressor in Battlestar Galactica?
It's been speculated that it's representative of like the interpolation of 9/11 and the U.S. occupation of Iraq.
Right. So it's a
so it's kind of like justification, but like using it in terms where we see this as like a distant ideology rather than like what's happening today.
Right. Because I think, and just going back to Star Trek had some quite forward-thinking episodes, with, like for example, Kirk's kiss with I think it was Uhura? Who was the black lady?
Uhuru?
Uhuru, yeah. There was obviously some examples of people being more forward-thinking than we gave them credit for, but obviously the Russians being the aggressors was an interesting idea, considering both sides, you could argue, were quite aggressive with how they treated countries that maybe were moving outside of their sphere of influence.
Right, and that's where I think the whole idea of propaganda comes in, because you're like where you have been indoctrinated, I guess you would say. You would see one as the aggressor and one as the victim, but it can be switched based on wherever your idea is from, or like where your background is from. It's interesting seeing works like come out of, I would say, like South Africa, like District 9, where it kind of like takes like apartheid and looks at both sides rather than just blatantly using it to justify the actions of one side or the other.
Or really cheap, just going against. I mean, obviously apartheid bad. I think we can agree.
Yeah.
But you can make a really cheap, just like, look, apartheid bad. Applaud me.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Which is not what it did. It actually did
And
a
it's-
little bit of analysis and stuff.
and it's also not helpful to do that, because
No,
obviously,
it's pandering.
of course, obviously, most people who have some semblance of intelligence will know that apartheid was a bad thing. But it also helps to use sci-fi, as we talked about last episode. That
Now, Gandhi, I'm looking at our live stats for the podcast here, and we've just lost half of our South African listeners.
All right, we'll move off.
That's
of that
fine. We can lose them. It's fine.
No, not yet, Jodo.
I find it interesting you mentioned the Star Trek interracial kiss, because there's a lot with that. They intentionally flubbed all of the ones where they did a fake kiss, because they really wanted the real kiss to be the one that was put on in the
Right.
show. But also, in the same way that monster movies have for decades been a metaphor for LGBT issues, sci-fi has almost always been about race.
Right.
And the only major thing that goes outside of that I can think of is X-Men, which has always been about something, but has always shifted. I mean, obviously it started
it's
with
always about
Holocaust.
the home and the other. I would say they always other someone else, and whether it's from the view of the mutants and X-Men versus, and the other is everyone else that's not a mutant, or it's from the view of the people that aren't mutants and are trying to kill off all of mutants.
Right, this idea
the
that
specific metaphor has evolved with an X-Men, where it's been race, it's been gender, it's been sexuality, it's
Right.
been all the different things. Sci-fi sits very strongly on race, I find, at least.
So I agree with that. And bringing in the idea of imperialism with that statement, I think is intersectionality is all it is. Like there's so much going on with the underlying tones of a lot of sci-fi works, whether it's for or against these issues. And I feel like we almost all the time see either they frown upon interspecies relationships or they treat it as like a taboo, but it's kind of accepted, or the person that does it is kind of ostracized.
Yeah, there's sort of like that they're rebels if they're having sex with aliens, or if they're willing to intersect between species. Is that sort of perception that this is a taboo because currently interracial sex and things like that is considered a taboo. And I can speak from experience as a mixed race child, is that there was certainly that feeling of tension between the different communities that were brought together through me. Through me, there was a sort of, obviously, a conflict between the darker side and then the whiter side. Obviously, didn't agree that I should exist, and that can be the same in sci-fi, as this idea that children between alien and human shouldn't exist because, well, for one, I mean, there's the obvious scientific reason that they shouldn't exist, but there's also the social and cultural reason they shouldn't exist.
Right, and like I said, everything goes back to like the politics at the time where it was written or made or filmed. You could even see stuff that's written from like a long time ago that's been adapted into films where it kind of slights those underlying tones, but still keeps them in a way.
If it's built into the story, it's hard to remove
Right.
them, even if it's stuff that you personally don't want to include anymore. Like, ooh,
Right.
this wasn't great for its time. It's terrible now. How do I do the story without it?
Yeah,
And
No.
they do. They
that's
end up. That just makes them move further and further away from the original or
yeah, and
original.
that's the problem is you can't really. That's why Hollywood. When you see movies that were made in the old days that are getting remade today, a lot of the original meaning and a lot of the story is ripped out because obviously there are things that we used to do that no longer fly today.
Right.
So what are some examples of that? I suppose, Jag, is there a one that immediately comes to mind?
In sci-fi or in media in general?
Sci-fi media in general. I mean, it's
Because media in general, I think I mentioned before, Lord of the Rings and the orcs.
right. Yeah.
In his writings, it's quite clear that orcs are all of the aspects that he saw as negative in the more melanistic people. And then in the movies, they were like, well, let's make orcs less of a racist caricature of like African and Mongolian folk, and instead they made them a bit more of of
And
the World War
Japanese,
II
yeah,
Japanese
yeah.
caricatures, and it's like
Well, that's not
you've
any better.
tried to take something out which was bad, and I approve of that.
But in doing so, you've
You've
become the very thing you swore to destroy. Yeah.
and maybe not even intentionally. He was like, "Oh, I have to replace it with something else that's bad," and I'm sure Peter Jackson wasn't looking at World War II propaganda and going, "That's what I want. That's it."
Yeah.
He probably just went, "What is something that we agree is not visually appealing?"
Ugly
And it's
things.
things people have used in caricature of
Right. Yeah.
races they don't like. So they're like, "Well,
So the question,
it's just because other
yeah,
people have used the same bad stuff."
and the question I think that then brings is like, well, how do we make a creature that is visually unappealing without resorting to using old propaganda? Because a lot of this old propaganda really did a good job at making people not human. That was the whole point of it, wasn't it? I mean, the way that the
Oh yeah,
Nazis
you need to
portrayed,
dehumanize.
yeah, the way the Nazis portrayed Jews in order to make it like acceptable in the mind of the average SS guard to be able to persecute them in such a way was necessary in order to dehumanize those people, which is obviously
Now, do you
wrong.
have a bad guy goblin without it
Yeah,
being a little Jewish?
I'm
yeah,
gonna reference back to the Face Off show where they do a lot of this, and I think one thing that I've learned from that is that people are inherently uncomfortable with their own body, like humans are inherently uncomfortable with their own bodies. So anytime that you can bank on that and emphasize some aspect of human biology that's not that we think is gross, go for it.
yeah,
But it like a lot of people, what people think is gross can be
subjective.
prejudice. Yeah. So
I
you
mean,
have to, when you're banking on biology, I would say I would go under the layer of
Jag was
ancestry and skin, like
right. I mean, Jag was telling me about James Joyce, for example, and his love letters. I mean, those are fucking horrible. The ones Jag was reading out to me, but to him, those
Were they
were
so
seductive.
bad?
Well, I mean, talking about a butt
His
being full
missus
of,
loved it.
but talking about a butt being full of farts doesn't sound sexy to me. But to him, it clearly did, and clearly to her, it did as well. Which is subjective, and that's obviously completely fine if both sides are enjoying it. Whatever, go for it. But to me,
I
that
don't
would
want to
be
yuck anyone's yum. I just won't be part of it.
thanks for the Jag.
going back to alien creation.
Right.
It's like Jack said at the beginning of the episode, we have to stray from the metaphor of aliens being people that we just don't like or people from across other borders or whatever.
Right.
And look into what actually makes a character not likable, whether it's sharp teeth or like their eyes
Slimy
missing or
skin,
something
eyes
They
missing,
just don't have
distorted
eyes.
faces, yeah.
Yeah. But then you get into that, like the thing about
It's
like
potentially just straight
disability.
ableism, yeah.
Yeah.
Which sort of
Oh
makes a bit of
no!
it backs us into a bit of a corner there. But
Anything we use that's non-human has been used to dehumanize
oh yeah, of
humans.
course. Like
Right.
sharp teeth. I mean, there was the
Oof.
idea that sharp teeth obviously comes from the fangs of vampires, and vampires were used to dehumanize the Jews and other minority groups in Germany,
And others,
and
yeah.
yeah, other minority groups in
It's a bit
Germany
of Roma in there.
as like fangs suck because they're sucking the lifeblood of our country, and that's used to a degree as well in modern propaganda where we target in a xenophobic way. We target immigrants as the sucking the lifeblood of our country by taking money when in reality they're not doing that, but it's
Right.
used in propaganda. So yeah, there's always that thing where no matter what you do, there's going to be a historical example of that being used, but you can obviously be a bit more gentle with what you do and take
Right, and you can
certain things
also
into account.
pull from animals like it because the sharp teeth, we fear animals that have sharp
Right,
teeth.
that's a more
So if you
primal
pull in
example,
some
yeah.
more animalistic aspects, that probably is helpful in or like even like microbes and stuff. If you pull stuff from nature, you can find a way out of being offensive to anyone, to be honest. Like unless you go too hard on something like we just said that has been historically used to demonize another group of people.
As soon as you said sharp teeth, though, as an example, I do picture certain peoples who did sharpen teeth, and it's like we view that as a barbarianism,
And
as
then even the term
as
barbarian, yeah,
the
that's
uncultured savage sort of
yeah.
thing, and
I wouldn't
immediately
say
it's
we.
we as people, we as a culture, not we as in the ones in this room.
No,
Right.
we we don't sit
Historically,
there
that has
thinking.
been that way, but like the point being, you can pull from different
Yeah, of
species
course. There's
of
yeah,
things that are feared or not. There's a lot of inspiration out there. That's why I like that face-off show
aspect
because
of
they have a different inspiration every challenge. So and they come up with a lot of cool stuff.
and then there's
So I
also the
do
aliens
again
that are just
recommend.
ridiculous looking, like the ones that are just so far out there. I think a good example of that were the Pikes in Star Wars. I said Pikes, don't worry. And they were a
The fifth,
gang.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no. They were a gang of well they were known for being in a gang, and they look with their headdresses and everything, they look completely out of this world, and I think that's a good thing. And I don't,
They kind of look like birds,
yeah, like
like birds, but with fish. Like the
Peacock, right?
top half is bird, and then the bottom
yeah,
half is kind of like
and
fishy.
I think that I think maybe what we need to stop doing is using. I think there's a fine line here that needs to be drawn, which is, do we stop using visual elements as ways of telling them this guy's evil, or do we use story elements? So I know that the use of, so for example, if you look at Emperor Palpatine, you know he's bad. Like the wrinkled face, the fact that he looks like a ghoul, the black robe, the way he sticks at it, the way he talks, everything is clearly evil. But if you look at Palpatine in the prequels, he's got a very fatherly look to him, a very grandfather look that is meant to be. Yeah, that Jodo just put a picture of him, but that is him showing his evil, which is the picture where he's smiling at Anakin when he's just revealed that he is, in fact, the Sith Lord they've been hunting for. But
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know. So I've only ever seen if we can come up with a different way to show evil or show someone who has different intentions than you, than just them just being darker or having like raspy voice or yeah, I mean, or just like visually displeasing in a way that is like humanoid
yeah, and I
or
wonder.
like pulling characteristics for that we think are not
Well,
conventionally
there was
attractive
something.
in
Yeah,
humans and putting them on something that's not human and saying, "Oh, now he's evil because of that," is inherently also one not nice and also ableism
but there's also some
or
examples of
racism
that.
or yeah.
So, for example, Palpatine is a human that is white and all the things that we would consider in Western society to be the average person. but he's also the villain of the movie. And if you look at who some of the good guys are in Return of the Jedi, they're all aliens. Most of them are aliens. Admiral Akbar, for example, looks like a monster, but he's actually a stand-up admiral that is fighting for the rebellion, fighting for liberty, and fighting for freedom.
Right. But
So
if you look at Palpatine before he just the actor, and then what they did to him to make him look evil,
Right, yeah, exactly.
they enhanced his brow bone, they made his nose bigger.
Yeah,
There's some
his
obvious
nose is already
things
big.
that I mean, it's not that big. They made it a lot bigger, and the enhanced brow bone, they just pulled characteristics from pretty much other other
Races, yeah.
ancestries that they think are visually displeasing and put them on this man to make him look evil. And even like the like teeth where they're not as like clean, like as traditional stuff that we see as like
Right.
conventionally
I mean,
pretty, but they did the opposite.
I don't
But
think...
like what they think is conventionally pretty is like one ableism, one like classism for the teeth, and like it just is all bad. And there has to be a different way that we can do that.
Yeah, I think also what I was going to say is using characters who are either visually appealing or visually neutral, and using their character to be the thing that makes them evil is also a good way of doing things, because
Yes.
it actually enhances the storytelling. It also enhances how it also tells the story, which is don't judge a book by its cover, which isn't true of books, but is true of people. You know, there are some people who are, you know, they're heavily tattooed, and in our society that is seen as, or in Western society that's seen as a bad thing, but some of them are the nicest people you'll ever meet. Whereas some
Right.
people who have no tattoos and don't look menacing are some of the worst people you'll ever meet. I mean, there are some CEOs that I would say are more psychotic than the, well, not psychotic as in psychosis, but more sociopathic than some of the heavily tattooed relatives I have.
Right, but and like tattoos in your culture are a lot different than tattoos in
Western
mine.
culture, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
I mean, for example,
so
if you don't know
It's
what
true.
Maori tattoos look like, and it's Maori, if you're trying to look it up, is look at those tattoos. Those are from a warrior culture. We were a warrior people because we, you know, the Polynesians in general were seafaring warriors, and so we tried to make ourselves. It was also respect and an homage to our ancestors and to our gods, but it was also a form of showing the
It was
power of a warrior.
communication.
Yeah, yeah. It was a
It also,
secondary characteristic. Yeah.
if you were from a similar area, you could tell from someone's moko their actual ancestry to the point where you could name grandparents of theirs.
Right, yeah. And that was
Like,
a great way of
it's-
showing prestige among, you know, Europeans used clothing. You know, purple, for example, was a symbol of power in Rome because it was so hard to obtain. So if someone was wearing a purple cloak or a purple toga, it was clear they were powerful. They were either an emperor, they were some sort of powerful person, because the average man would not have purple or, what were some other colours, actually?
Royal blue.
Royal blue, yeah. There are things like that where...
Proper blue.
yeah, a lot of like deep jewel tones were used for royalty in a lot of cultures, I would say.
Mixed
Like the
fabric,
rich tones.
jewelry itself.
Jewellery, yeah.
Yeah.
For example, like, the average person doesn't have a crown in their attic like the Queen does that has jewels from all across the world that they stole. But still, that's a...
Yeah,
That's
would-
lost
show of
everyone in
power
Britain.
and influence.
We didn't steal them. Yes, you did. So, anyway...
It's hard to think outside of, like, because we talked about this kind of last week too,
Yeah.
thinking outside of humor
British.
normality and not projecting onto like what an alien culture would be. But since we don't know what an alien culture would look like,
Yeah. We can make it as
it's
strange
cool.
as we want.
It's cool to kind of start from like if you're visualizing or creating a character, if you're starting from the environment that they live in,
Yeah.
to see like what can be used for them to survive in that environment. Like if you have a planet that's mostly like dry or like has high gravity or something,
Yeah.
doing things to the character that would help it survive that, and pulling from species that currently live in that in the world, that I think that's the best way to do it,
So for
rather
the
than
scenario
making
you
and like
explained, sorry.
and I would just say making their actions show whether they're good or bad,
Right. So for
and
the
like
scenario you
writing a good storyline.
yeah. So for the story for the environment you explained, I would expect them for low gravity. I would expect them to be probably short or what's
Yeah.
so they're not quite as like tall as some humans are. But then
Well,
also
no.
for the
Well, low gravity, that would be high gravity. Low gravity, like you would need to be heavy to be like to stay on the surface of the planet
right,
in low gravity. So, they would have to have like it's something about bone density. They would either have to have denser bones or something. I
right.
can't
So they
honestly
would have to
remember.
be thick boned,
Right.
um, dense
But
boned would be a
but
better way of
if
saying
it's
that.
in like a hot climate with that as well, you would need to have a certain amount of
And then
surface area to dispel that heat, or a certain way to dispel that heat, whether it's pores or like sweating or like the way that we do. So I think that there's a lot of ideas if you come from the environment and look at things that help different species survive in those environments, and
right,
then
yeah.
putting that together, that I think would make a more successful alien character than just slapping different features onto another like a humanoid like starting point.
I can't remember if it was by one of the ones by Banks or by Reynolds, but there was an alien species that had a literal heat sink biologically part of them
Right.
naturally, just because they really needed to.
And there has to be
And
something in the storyline that highlights this. So it's not just lost on people, I think, too, because a lot of people aren't going to know the biology behind like something surviving in an environment. So there has to be something where if it's a camera angle or if it's them actually using that portion of their body in the movie or work, that would be make it a better character design than just having it just for the look of it and then not addressing it.
I think there is a big issue in the form of media, though, because in writing, it's really easy to get through someone's intentions behind their actions, because you can just take a peek at their thoughts. In a
Right.
movie, you do have to use these shorthands of, oh, this person's lit well, this person's lit poorly. Now you know whose side you're on.
Right. That's what I'm saying. There has to be more to it than that. You can't just make someone darker inherently, which is not good in general. And as either with lighting or with makeup, and then make them the bad guy. There has to be some inherent or underlying story, whether it's the music that you use, like the what is that called? The score of a movie, has to either be changing with the person or like the small actions you see, or even just the characters talking about them, like the characters that you start off in the movie are like, we don't like those guys, they're doing this and this, and then we see them later and like, oh, that's who they're talking about, and then you make your own formulation, like why are they the bad guys, and then the actions will come in. So there's a lot of ways around it, I would think, instead of having to hear their thoughts.
Well, yeah, they do say always show, not tell, and I think giving someone's thoughts some page space is kind of telling as opposed to showing. But again, with media, like if a book takes 20 hours to read because it's that large, that's fine. If a movie takes 20 hours to watch
Yeah.
because you had to explain everything, that's a terrible movie.
Right. There's definitely a
So
lot of
you
differences
have to
between
go
adaptation
lazy.
into a movie, and I mean, you don't have to go lazy. You can just like there's like this isn't sci-fi, but I was talking to someone about Harry Potter recently, and they had read all the books and watched all the movies multiple times over for both things, and they said that you can't compare them because they're separate entities. They're both good, and that she thought that if you put that they pulled or they left out just the right things in the movies. So if you pull some, if you're adapting from is that the right word? If you're making an adaptation from a book, um, you can look into
It
that
has to
story
be
and
an
fully
adaptation.
understand it. And if you leave out the right things, it works. Like in the Harry Potter movies, there's some people that don't like the Harry Potter movies, but I don't care about you guys. To be
Yeah,
honest, they're
Jesus
great
Christ.
movies. I mean, the acting, they're children actors, so the first few movies aren't like the acting's not great, but the
They got
storyline,
better.
everything is like everything's good. They left the perfect things out from the books. So like that can be done in other realms. It can't. It's not only for Harry Potter. Like other people, they just don't take the amount of time they need. I think writers that are making adaptations don't take the time that they need to fully understand or work with the writer, or if it's that they're still alive, or work with a fan base.
But sometimes working the
I was more thinking things made initially for movie as opposed to an adaptation,
Okay.
but there is
Yeah, initially
definitely
for
an
movie.
issue with people who expect a translation
right,
from
yeah.
book to movie as opposed to adaptation.
Right.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is people who working with a fan base is always to me a bad idea because they're going to want even I say that as a Star Wars fan, even if they had pandered to the Star Wars community, they would have failed because people want things that they don't realize they don't actually want.
I mean, you can
They
talk
won't
to
like
the
what
fan
they
base
want.
without using
Yeah.
everything they say. You can talk to the fan base to understand the storyline more and like the
Yeah,
culture around the work rather than just pulling what they say and throwing it all into a movie.
that seems to be what they did. What they
I
did
mean,
with the
that's
last
yeah.
one.
I mean, yeah. This is just suggestions. I don't make movies. They don't pay me enough to make movies. If someone wanted to pay me enough to like put me on a movie just to give them advice out, I could do that. But
Well, maybe if we get big
um,
enough. But
I don't have the qualifications for that yet. So
so we talked about how we would make things ourselves, but let's also talk about an alien empire. So, what would, in your mind, make a great alien empire?
well,
Jet, yeah,
we have to
Internal
define great.
consistency.
internal consistency.
Do you mean great like in the content of it, great or within the like world
Both.
that this is living in?
Let's fully explore what we would perceive to be a great alien empire, because there's multiple things that can be fun. For example, some would say uh, species homogeny would make a well, that seems to be the thing, is most empires are either a human empire or a alien empire or some sort of species that is unified, but maybe there's a way of sort of forming a culture together rather than separating them into different groups.
I think for the sake of content, um, a successful alien empire would have to have like different facets of the empire, where it just doesn't show face value, like a big empire. Like there has to be, you have to show the little boroughs within a culture of an empire. Um, I think that makes it so very successful. Like, and I think there's mixed reviews. Have you guys ever seen Riddick, the
No.
Riddick trilogy?
Like
Um,
Chronicles and Dark
the
Side or
Chronicles of
whatever.
Riddick, yeah.
Yeah.
So when he goes to these different places, you see the families and the stuff that live in there. I mean, like sometimes they just show the empire and they don't go into depth with them. But like I like the parts where he's like in these cities and walking around and talking to where you can see the different aspects of the people that live there, rather than just him fighting this big army.
So for you, it's the social verticality,
Right.
the high, the low, the entire culture.
Yeah, I would like to see the different facets of the culture rather than just this big empire's coming for us and then they send a few warriors, then that only all the few warriors
That
are
also
all that you see.
that also boils down to the degrading of fiction in general. Is this idea that things need to be quick, fast. No one's got an attention span, so we need to do things like it's like when in old Western films when the bad guys always wore black and the good guys always wore white. It's that sort of
Right.
idea of no one has time to figure out who's who and what's what. But in that time, it was because of the limitations of technology. Now it's more people don't want to spend an hour thinking, is that the bad guy? Is that the bad guy? People just want to know who the bad guy is, rather than
Yeah, and
actually
if
spending time
yeah,
thinking about it.
you're right. about that,
And-
especially with attention spans.
And quite often the best things don't have a bad guy; they have competing
Factions.
desires.
Yeah. Which is
Well, even
which
just
is
like
great.
I
this
think that's
bad
very
guy
true.
wants what's best for his in group.
Yeah,
I think the competing
which is a
desires
great
storyline is a lot better.
which is a great source of conflict. Is this? I mean, I think evil empires and things like that are now an old thing. I don't think they need to be in fiction anymore, and I think that's why I think a lot of people didn't enjoy the new sequel trilogy in Star Wars. I hate to keep bringing it back to Star Wars, but that's all I know. Is people didn't like it because evil empires are just not really that
Well,
interesting
it's
anymore.
it's been done quite a lot, like we talked about in our imperialism
Yeah,
segment.
the
And it's
imperialism
just
segment.
people are getting to the point where they're aware that that's not a good thing anymore, so they're like, "Oh, it's obvious like which side you should choose." Like
And if you
it
don't
depends.
choose it, you're an emo. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fine for a popcorn movie.
Yeah.
I mean, I read a lot of garbage, and it's fun.
Yeah, Jake reads the Nancy Drew.
Sometimes it's what you want.
Oh yeah. Sometimes you just want to shut off and watch or read something, but I think if you're looking, I think that also is reflective of a maybe not necessarily a good thing that's happening.
Right, and I think that it just shows that things aren't really captivating audiences anymore because everything's a trope now.
Yeah. I think
And
that's
creating a good empire, I think, comes down to a good storyline. And if people are willing to engage in that storyline, then go ahead. Like that's it right there. That's all you need is a good storyline and people willing to engage with it.
Oh yeah, but I think a good storyline naturally can hide a lot of. So someone, I think it was Neil Gaiman, talks about this in Masterclass, is the idea that when you're world building, you don't need to flesh everything out. Not everything needs to have a meaning behind it. Not everything needs to be a completed story. You just need to give the image of a completed story. If the story requires it, yes, then make it into something. But if the story doesn't require it, it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be fleshed out completely. Like if you have a mountain in the distance, you don't need the history of the mountain, all the battles that were fought on the mountain, all the houses that are near it, all the you know what I mean? So some people can fall
Yeah.
down the
You
opposite
don't have
trap.
to go full Tolkien,
You
yeah.
don't have to never go full Tolkien. But yeah,
Unless you're
so
Tolkien.
unless you're Tolkien, or unless you're obsessed with world building. I mean, building's a lot of fun if you enjoy that sort of thing.
Hmm.
I think if it's critical to the storyline that you have, then include it.
Oh yeah, of course. But
I
there are
suppose
some people
that's
who
where it
just
comes.
vomit at the mouth when they,
Right.
sorry, vomit at the pen when they start writing out their sci-fi or fantasy story.
Yeah, you
I
can't
suppose
have
it's
a empire that's based on like that's nature driven or like that's geography driven and then not include like if there is that mountain and that they like worship that mountain, you have to include what it's about and people that are around it. But like if it's not necessary, don't include it.
Yeah.
it would be weird to have a holy site and then not mention the religion. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the
Or
holy
go in
site.
depth with it. You're just like, oh, here's a holy site, we worship it, and then go on to do something else. Like it takes away from the whole empire at that point, or the whole community,
Right.
which
It doesn't give enough
inherently is part of your
context.
character's identity.
Yeah. Which is very
And it
good.
also comes back to my whole like consistency thing. It's all right to have gaps in a story where there can be things. It's just not all right to have gaps in a story where it's like, but then why wouldn't they? You know, there's
Right.
plot holes,
But
and
I
then
feel
there's just
I feel like plot
spaces to
holes.
explore.
Yeah. I think plot holes only become evident if you overthink the movie or if the writing is bad. I think is the two things that may like if you're watching the Fast and Furious movies, there are going to be plot holes, there are going to be problems with logic, and there's going to be problems with everything because it's a popcorn movie. It's not made for a I'm trying not to sound elitist here.
Critics.
Critics. It's not made for critics. Yeah. So
It's made for audiences.
it's made for audiences. It's a very nice
I feel
way of
like
saying
I've gotten
it.
to the point where I only watch content to critique it now, though, because it's gotten so bad.
It's gotten so
Oh, you're
bad.
gonna miss some fun things though.
Especially with I always go back to horror because it's mostly what I watch. Like horror movies, like I said, I literally only watch them at this point, not for entertainment. I guess I get entertainment out of like
Critiquing
critiquing
can be
them.
fun.
But the storyline is never good enough for me to actually be entertained by it.
But there's
Like
also
I would
the
much rather be entertained by the storyline and the context of the movie rather than entertained by because I predicted something correctly or like because I'm mad that I had to predict something in it.
right, and I mean that also shows a maybe more about us than we think, but there's also this element of making of when these films are made. There's also the other side of this, which is going too far with this sort of thing we're talking about. You know, for example, I watched The Irishman recently, and it's about 3 hours long, and a lot of it, you know, I don't know if it was needed. I know Scorsese is obviously a master at his craft, but there is sort of that thing where if there's a set thing where movies need to have a certain amount of time, but there's also the element of if the writing's good, that can sometimes gloss over the amount of time. I mean, for example, I haven't. I know I'm about to shock a lot of people, but I haven't read Lord of the Rings, and nor do I intend to.
It's
But
long.
it is. But it also that's why in the
He likes
movie.
describing trees.
That's why in the movie The Hobbit, when I watched it, I was completely out of the story because it was something. It was a crazy amount of time to spend on something I had no fucking clue what it was about or why it was interesting. And in fact, then I found out most people don't like The Hobbit, and then I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Well,
But
I recently watched Dune because it came out recently.
right,
The new one, of course.
I heard a lot of not good things about it.
It was definitely made for people who've read it.
right.
If you haven't read it, it's bad.
Well,
You're
and
like a
I
big
never
twist with
realized that it was
Mentat.
supposed to be like a series. There were two of them, so I think a lot of people went into the first movie thinking, didn't not knowing that there was going to be another one, and they're like lost the whole time. Like I
Oh,
thought this was going to be faster.
having read the books, I was definitely going into it going, how far will they get? Because
How many
I
books
mean,
are there?
I've got, I think, 9 books on my bookshelf, and there's definitely a lot more because I don't have all the house books.
What
Uh,
did you think of the movie then? Did you enjoy it having
um,
read the books?
yes, but it also seeing the parts where it was like, oh, the Doctor turning. I hope spoiler. Sorry. Oh my god, it's based on the books. If it's old.
It's old.
I
Get
did.
over
It
it.
did kind of hurt me going again, sort of like critiquing it, being like, when I saw things where it's like, I only get this because I've read it. That took me out of it in its own way because it's like
Well, why? How?
those thoughts were intrusive
Right.
because I couldn't
Yeah.
help but point it out to myself like that wouldn't be impactful to other people unless they've read it or watched the series or watched the older movie versions. But you cannot go into it blind. It won't work.
Right.
And I didn't go into it blind, and I still hurt because of it.
And I think that's about an hour, so we'll wrap up here. But let's just give some closing thoughts. So obviously,
Yeah, what were
Alien.
we talking about?
Yeah, we went off on a tangent there. Obviously, in terms of aliens, there's a lot of possibilities, but there's also a lot of limitations. Is what I'll finish on. Jode, you go ahead.
I will say that there are a lot of other sources to pull from than imperialism, prejudice, and anything associated with prejudice.
Go ahead, Jag.
The best Star Wars movies was when he had to listen to his editors.
Well, that's
Thanks,
gonna start
guys.
a war. Bye.